Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Thank you, and welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Interview Series. I am Paul Vogelzang. You know, a black suit may look ordinary, familiar, almost invisible to some. But what if that plain, dark suit is one of the most powerful political symbols ever created? Between the American Revolution and the Civil War, men's clothing changed dramatically. Bright colors, ornate fabrics, decorative waistcoats, and aristocratic display began to give way to dark wool, simpler lines, and remarkable uniformity. Smithsonian Associate fashion historian Chloe Chapin calls it the movement from peacocks to penguins. I love that. Smithsonian Associate Chloe Chapin is with us today. She's going to be appearing at Smithsonian Associates. Coming up, please check out our show notes for more details about the wonderful Chloe Chapin and her work. You are just going to love this episode. You're going to find that Chloe Chapin argues that this change in men's fashion was tied to much larger ideas about democracy, equality, masculinity, seriousness, and authority. Chloe Chapin's new book is Suitable: The Sartorial Revolution and the Fashioning of Modern Men. Smithsonian Associate Chloe Chapin will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates, but we have Chloe Chapin today. Chloe Chapin is a former Broadway costume designer who brought a maker's eye into the historical archive. Chloe Chapin found George Washington complaining for years that his trousers did not fit. This is kind of a funny story, actually. Chloe Chapin found presidents dressed in black, tailors advertising color, and portraits telling a very different story. Chloe Chapin also found in her research that plainness was never neutral. It was constructed, repeated, and eventually accepted as the natural uniform of power. Today, we ask what the suit helped create, who it helped exclude, and why it still returns whenever someone wants to look credible, dependable, or in charge. Welcome to the Smithsonian Associates Interview Series. I'm Paul Vogelzang. This is the Not Old Better Show. We have our guest, Chloe Chapin, author of this wonderful new book titled Suitable. Please check out our notes for all kinds of information about Chloe Chapin and her work and her upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. Let's welcome her today.
Chloe Chapin, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
It is great to talk to you. We're going to talk about this wonderful book that you've shared with me. I can't wait to share it with our audience, as well as talk about your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, which I know is going to be of interest to our audience because we're going to talk about clothes. And we're going to talk about men's clothes. In particular, the title is Suitable: The Sartorial Revolution and the Fashioning of Modern Men. So great title. Congratulations on this book. This has got to be a fun subject for you, too.
Yeah, thanks so much. It really is. It kind of blends a lot of different parts of my life and career and interests, as I'm sure you could see in the book. And it's really fun to be able to share it with people.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting into it. I want to talk about the suit, though. And you kind of write about the black suit, black men's suit. Sometimes we hear about the little black dress. We're going to talk about the men's suit, the men's black suit. And it's very clear in the book that this is kind of an article of clothing that really is very rooted in plainness. And plainness can be a good thing. It can be a good thing in politics. And you talk about it in respect to politics as being kind of plain and natural. It's kind of outside fashion in that sense. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this idea of how something like this just kind of disappears before our very eyes. This plainness really is a reflection of something very powerful, but yet we don't see it. And I guess I thought about it as I was doing my research. Is it because we're seeing the man? We're not, and is that what is preferred here?
Wow, that is such a good series of questions.
Sorry,
So
lots of questions for
no,
you.
it's really good. So maybe just to back up a little bit, one thing I think is interesting about this ensemble, as you mentioned, is why do we call it the suit? Right?
Yeah.
It's actually many, many suits over many, many people over many, many years. And we don't say the jacket or the
Uh-huh.
dress or the hat. But interestingly, you pointed out one of the other kinds of garments that we have categorized as a as a singular, which
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
little black dress.
Yeah.
And we say that about like the white t-shirt or the denim
Hmm.
jacket or the biker jacket or something. So I think it's really interesting that the suit has become something so important that it has become singular. It's not just many, many versions of things, but there is sort of one overarching institutionalized, dare I say,
Hmm.
ensemble. It's not a garment, it's a collection of garments. Um, but then your question is about plainness. Is that what makes it disappear? And I would say there's actually two different components to it. And I want to say too that black is the dominant color for the suit or the suits that I'm
Hmm.
thinking about in this book. It's not the only color. We do see, especially in, contemporary menswear, we see navy and charcoal, and there's not a whole lot of other options when it comes to,
Right. Right.
really like professional suits. Maybe you get a medium blue or a medium
Yeah.
gray, but you don't
Add a
see a lot of
pinstripe.
purple
Yeah.
or green or
Right. Right.
whatever, not a
Yeah.
lot of loud colors, not a lot of
Right.
stripes or floral patterns or things like that,
Mm-hmm.
which would be common in women's clothing or men's clothing
Yeah.
in another period. So I
Yeah.
think that there's two different things, or maybe three, in terms of what makes suits suits, and that is plainness, like you say, but there's a uniformity to it too. And that's the thing that I found really interesting about this, those two things together, is that there's a lot of sameness in the masculine wardrobe. And that's like between the range of suits that one man might have in his closet at any given time, but also the range between one man's closet and another man's closet in any given time, but also the way that it hasn't really changed much over time. So when I sort of am forced to define what I mean by suits or modern suits, because I think that there's sort of two different periods of suits that you could think about in human history or recent history, and this modern suit that I'm thinking of, which I am thinking of sort of the ideas behind it are crystallizing around the American Revolution, and then it's sort of in place by around 1850. And the three things that I think categorize those suits are plainness, uniformity, and a lack of change over time, which make it really hard to see. It's almost designed to be invisible in a way because of those three components.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very helpful to know. It's good to kind of set the stage with that too. Again, congratulations on the book. The research is amazing. You talk about kind of pre-revolutionary period up to the 1800s, and you really kind of define the suit as becoming um, a symbol, perhaps, of kind of this idea of lowercase r Republican equality. But it's being defined by men, primarily for men. And so I want to ask you about kind of the odd juxtaposition there with this idea of equality,
Yeah.
but it's not exactly for
Yeah.
everybody. It is for a select few. This suit is that special.
I think this is a real tension in American history in general, is this idea of equality, because there's, on one hand, we like to define America as being a land of equality and freedom and independence and democracy. And yet we are forced to reckon with the fact that that idea or definition of equality was never meant to be for everyone in the way that we might think of equality today. It was never going to be applied to people who were enslaved or women or other people who fell outside of the category of people that the founding fathers were thinking of as being, participants in this new form of equal republic, which would be white propertied men. And I think that that's just a part of wrestling with American history, is that we can celebrate the movement forward that they did make while also, I don't know if it's holding them accountable, but just sort of holding ourselves accountable for the idea that definitions of words can change over time, and equality is certainly one of them. I think it's really maybe I'll say it's also, I think, a useful thing about studying history is it sort of forces us to unknow things that we think we know. This idea that equality we might think of today as being sort of an unqualified good, and a clear definition that equality means the same thing for all people. And I think studying American history in particular, and maybe the history of clothing sort of secondarily, can help us think, well, maybe there are some nuances to that we can unpack a little bit.
Yeah, there's a really interesting intersection. You go back and talk about George Washington and the fact that he wore a black suit to his mother's funeral. And that's a really early kind of symbolic gesture that other politicians picked up on. And so I wonder, as kind of a tradition, um, how did that actually kind of move into this whole becoming a uniform
Yeah.
for all of these white men?
It's a great question. I think it's a really good question to ask after thinking about unknowing things. Like, how
Yeah,
do we
yeah.
unknow the relationship that we imagine today for the sort of co-definition of suits and men, right? That it's like hard to imagine, say, politicians or stockbrokers without suits, but it's hard to imagine suits without white men in them. They sort of, even the word suit became, used to apply to the men who wear them. So, one way that we can do that is to remind ourselves that in the 18th century, nobody was really wearing black. It was worn for civilian uniforms like judges and priests, um, and for morning dress. It was worn by many people, but not for fashion. It was a specific type of uniform, which is something that we can think about in terms of how it was then adopted for this uniform of masculinity or the republic or however we want to define it. So another thing that is interesting to remember about George Washington is that he didn't always wear black suits. In fact, the inaugural suit that he wore was brown. So I think that's a fun thing to imagine. Even if we were to imagine that everyone dressed just like George Washington, what if we were all wearing brown suits today instead of black suits today? That's a whole different way of thinking about like current international aesthetics is imagining everyone in a brown suit. But Washington adopted this black suit, as you say, because his mother died and it was a kind of mourning dress. Now, how one man's mourning dress turned into this like institutionalized everybody wearing it is a bit of a mystery. And there's a couple different ideas that I have, and I would love to hear other people's ideas. But one of them is just how important George Washington was. He was such an icon. He was a military icon, a political icon. And when he started traveling around the country on these sort of presidential tours, people noted what he was wearing at every stop. It was always reported in the newspapers. People were described as wearing things made out of black velvet that were sort of in tribute to him. So they were already starting to associate black velvet with Washington and not just mourning. Um, and the other thing that was happening in 1789, right after or around the time when Washington was elected, was the French Revolution and the meeting of the Estates General. And they were all wearing black suits also. Now, I don't think that that's why Washington adopted black, but black was also being associated with other revolutionaries across the Atlantic. And so, is it possible that people in France and England picked up wearing black, because of that revolution, it trickled over to America? Was it possible that Americans picked it up because they wanted to be like Washington and it trickled back over the Atlantic? Maybe both happened at the same time. Fashion is really complicated. There's very rarely a clear, you know, inventor and origin story. But both of those things were probably happening. And another real question I have is about the relationship between trends in dress and trends in portraits. Because you wear dress in portraits, but I think that they actually have sort of different fashions. And so what I mean by that is Gilbert Stuart very famously painted George Washington again and again and again and again. He was like, this is my ticket. I can just keep pumping out copies of this guy because he's so famous, and I'm going to just like make money for the rest of my life painting new pictures of George Washington. So then he also painted other founding fathers, including other people after they became president, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. And he painted them in black suits also. Now, why were they wearing black suits, right? So is it because Gilbert Stuart was like, well, I did such a good job selling these portraits of this first guy. Maybe I'll just paint them as close to that guy as possible. And maybe the trend happened because of these images that were circulated. That is certainly possible. And Washington wore this black velvet suit as a kind of marker of his station long past when someone would stop wearing morning dress. So there's another thing happening in there, and we have some evidence of that. There were people who would go to his reception, his weekly receptions where the public could come in and meet with him. And on his receptions, which were once a week, he was reported wearing this black velvet suit, just like in the Gilbert Stuart Lansdowne portrait of him, with powdered wig tied in a bow, with a dress sword and a chapeau de bras, which is this foldable hat that you wear under your arm. So it's kind of like court dress, a little bit. He wasn't wearing it fancy. It wasn't embroidered. It was plain, but it was black velvet, not wool, even though he had worn a wool suit to his inauguration. So he was clearly adopting this costume, let's say, as a way of representing this brand new station for which he had zero models. It's not like he could write to his other presidents around the world and be like, hey, so what are us presidents wearing? The only example he had was kings, and he didn't want to be a king. So what's interesting is that same traveler reports going to Martha Washington's receptions, which were on a different day of the week. And there he says, President Washington did not consider himself to be there in his official capacity as president. He was there as a private citizen. Whether or not a president is ever allowed to be a private citizen is another question. But at the time, that was what Washington wanted. And this person says Washington didn't wear black at that point. He wore a coat of some other color, and he didn't have a dress sword. And that dress sword is a really important marker of whether or not something is court dress. So clearly, kind of reading through the lines, you can see that Washington just sort of was like, I don't know what to wear, but this feels fancy or different or formal or something. And then it's clear that other presidents adopted that as kind of, well, Washington had set the standard and they just thought, well, that works. I'll keep wearing that thing. And so then you can see how black sort of trickles from there outside of this, costume for the president. And it starts to be worn by other politicians and then other prominent people. And then, again, around by 1850, it's clearly established as just something that men in the American Republic wear and associate with their position as citizens in this new democracy.
Yeah, it was almost as though, certainly in kind of reading the book and researching for our conversation, it was almost so there was this club that was forming. Men were wearing this particular outfit, and we in the public wanted to see them in that particular outfit. That was important because tailors had plates of plenty of different fabrics available.
Yeah. Frederick Douglass talks about this. This is not in the book, but he talks about this. Once you publish a book and you have your portrait, an engraving of your portrait in that book, the public never wants you to change. Like, God forbid you change your facial hair if they have associated you with a particular kind of facial hair. And, Frederick Douglass is writing this closer towards the end of the 19th century. But it's a really interesting observation, right? That someone who is a member of the, you know, public, that the you're enough of a celebrity that the public thinks that they own a part of you maybe or expect something of you. That, I think this word costume is interesting in this context. It comes from the word custom, and it doesn't start to have the sort of association with performance costume until right around the end of the 18th century. An interesting period. No idea if it's related to this, process of American history. But but how much of a costume is something that someone is intentionally wearing as a marker of their station, like Washington? And how much of that costume is something that the audience is actually projecting onto them, saying, "We want you to wear a costume. We think that you're more recognizable to us by wearing something different than the rest of us."
Yeah, it was in many instances, and I hope you'll tell us this story too a little bit. In many instances, it was an uncomfortable costume, particularly for Washington, and he complained about his trousers not fitting well, and so perhaps it was just such an important symbol that the fact that it didn't fit as well was really kind of an afterthought. What do you think about that? Is that kind of the process here of thinking?
So, one of the things, and maybe we can talk about my background a little bit,
That'd be great.
where
Yeah, that'd be
I
great.
come to this project as both a historian and as a practitioner. My background was in costume design. And so I spent 20 years, maybe more than that, dressing people in clothes. And so I have a really, material, embodied, interpersonal understanding of the way that clothing works. And a lot of those things are hard to find in the archival record. But knowing how someone feels in their clothes is something that's often very mysterious about people in the past. And so I encountered in my research this whole series of letters, which you're referring to, of George Washington writing to his tailor back in London, complaining that his pants don't fit. And this is not just one letter. This is a series of letters over a period of over 10 years. Now, it's not when he's president. So that's a little bit of a qualification. This is a little bit earlier. It's in the 1750s and 60s when he considers himself to be British. He's a bit of an aristocrat owning this, giant plantation at Mount Vernon, owning many slaves. And because of his station, he considers himself to be the kind of person that should have a London tailor. So he never actually met his tailor in person. That tailor never saw his body, never measured him, and was just making stuff up for somebody across the Atlantic. And it's not like there were no tailors in Virginia, but Washington just, believed himself to be of the class that would, not just order fabric from England, which is where, everyone of his station would been getting fabric from, because America didn't have the kind of manufacturing that they could produce high enough quality clothing or textiles that they would want to make their clothing out of. But he could have had a local tailor make it up. And so that's what's really interesting. It was his choice to keep ordering clothing from this London tailor, even though, as he says, his breeches were almost always too short and too tight. And as soon as I found that in the archives, I just thought, wow, that is such a relatable story. I think everybody knows what it feels like for your pants to be too short and too tight. Um, and yet, how many books are there about George Washington? And that's something that's so rarely talked about. Because how can we fit that idea in with our picture of him as this, national hero, this Cincinnatus who renounces power and, wants to just go back and live his, simple life away from the public eye. And that was one of the reasons it was really important for me to include it in this, is just to help us think that, there are all of these stories about people and their relationships with clothing that just haven't been told yet, and that still exist in the archival record and otherwise.
Yeah, and especially thank you for that too. I thought that the work that you did, the research that you did on the subject of technology and cotton was really interesting, and that's part of chapter 2. You kind of talk about made in America, and And you kind of think, well, who was it that was making some of this stuff, and how was that compared to elsewhere? And this notion of homespun really becomes a part of the conversation. So I wondered about it as I was kind of creating my list of questions for you. Is that kind of an important economic fact here, or was that just kind of for appearance purposes only? Excuse the pun.
I think this is another word that we have to question the meaning of, because most of us, I think, associate the word or the idea of homespun with the later 19th century idea of it, which is this sort of intentionally rustic, almost anti-fashion, where people are making their own clothes, and we have kind of an association of what that might look like: rough, undyed, really unfashionable, sort of excessively, radically plain. Now, that's not entirely how people were using that term in the early half of the 19th century. Thomas Jefferson writes a letter at some point, I think when he's president, saying, "Homespun has become the idea of our time." But what he means when he says that is he wants domestically manufactured textiles, right? So he wants things to be made in America. But it's not like he wants them to be intentionally rustic. That same brown inaugural suit of George Washington's is another good example. I think we like to talk about that as homespun because to our eyes, it doesn't look fancy. It's not velvet. It doesn't have embroidery on it. But we call it the plain brown wool suit. It's always called the plain brown suit. But brown was a very fashionable color at this time period. And Washington didn't request brown. He wanted the best quality woolen textiles that could be made in America. He wanted them to be made in America, but he wanted the best. And it took a long time to find anything that was this good. He commissioned his friend General Henry Knox to help him track some down, and Knox, or he had heard about this new manufacturing company in Connecticut. And so Knox ordered a bunch of different yardages from this in different colors, because often the color of the dyes will affect the quality of the woolens and the finishing of it and everything. And so he ordered a bunch of different colors, and he sends one of them on to Washington saying, "I haven't bothered to send you on the rest because they're not good enough quality. I think they're not going to meet the standards of you and Mrs. Washington." And that yardage that he sends along to them is 13 yards of bottle green wool. So that was like the second choice. Washington's inaugural suit was almost green. So also imagine what would happen if everyone today was wearing green suits. We would be living in a totally different world. And then a couple weeks later, he gets another shipment in of this brown wool, and he sends that on to Washington. And it looks nicer. It's a better quality. And so Washington picks that brown fabric to have made into a suit. But it's the nicest quality that America can produce. And that was what they meant by homespun at the time, is they wanted to compete with England in terms of their manufacturing. They didn't want it to be an aesthetic choice. It was a commercial choice. And that, I think, is a big difference.
Yet there is an aesthetic choice being made in the book, because you have just these amazing pictures throughout the book. And I really just want to encourage our audience to check out a copy of the book, Suitable, just to go through and see the pictures. One that just caught my eye that I just loved. You refer to this fashionable buck who is shown in the kind of the cartoon that he's really giving his laundress what for over this idea of his shirt not being white. And you talk about the labor of whiteness, very much an aesthetic as opposed to a commercial element there.
So I love this question. This was such a hard thing to see in my research. So, I think a lot of times when we look at books, it seems sort of like common sense, the structure of it and the contents and everything. But when you're in the archives, it's like you're just swimming around in this soup where there's so many different possible avenues to think of. And it's almost like, if you look up at the night sky and see all of those stars, and the process of writing is actually trying to like draw a picture and make a constellation with those stars that exist. But there's so many different other points of reference that you could follow too. And so whiteness was not initially something that I was thinking about, because I was really thinking about the black suits. And, in the 18th century, everybody was wearing white shirts then too. But the more I looked at those portraits of especially American presidents, I had a research fellowship at the Smithsonian, and I would hang out in the National Portrait Gallery and just think about like, it's so weird that here we are in this room where everybody's all these white dudes in black suits. But the more I was there, the more I was like, wait a minute, they're not just in black suits. Those white shirts are really important to that aesthetic, that high contrast where there's that brilliant white. At the beginning, they're wearing cravats with the, nice ties or ruffly shirt fronts or something. And then, later on in the decades, they start having black ties but there's still that white collar. And I think if I had been researching any other period or maybe even demographic, I wouldn't have focused on the whiteness of shirts, because I think shirts are sort of invisible too. They're Because they're mostly hidden under the coat, and all you really see is usually the collar and maybe a little bit of the shirt front. But they're also really seen as underwear for most of this period. And so we wouldn't necessarily talk about them when we're talking about the aesthetics of things. But one thing I thought about when I was looking at these, American presidential portraits is the difference between a painting of George Washington and a painting of Abraham Lincoln. In terms of the way that you would describe them, they would sound pretty similar, right? Like black suit, white shirt. But Washington's suit would have been probably a silk velvet, and his shirt would have been linen, whereas Lincoln's suit would be wool and his shirt would be cotton. And so I talk about the change between silk to wool because that's such an obvious change, and there's so much impact on how it changes the construction of things because the materials are so different. Materials of linen and cotton are less different. They look more similar, especially in a painting, and they function in more or less the same way. But there are subtle differences to them. And it was thinking about that change that really got me thinking about not just the material quality of linen and cotton, but the whiteness of it, and how much labor was involved in bleaching those fibers white in the first place in order to make them into textiles. But more importantly than that, the maintenance that they would require. I don't know about you, Paul, but anytime I get a nice, crisp, clean, brand new white collared shirt, invariably, the first time I have it on, I'm drinking a cup of coffee, I'm eating spaghetti,
Right.
I've got some Doritos,
Right.
right? And, like, there's some little stain is gonna show up on them, and I'm gonna be really annoyed that, like, I should have covered it up with a napkin or something when I was eating. And it's not like I'm so much of a slobbier eater than someone in the 19th century, that you have to imagine, especially those men wearing formal wear with the really low buttoning vests where they've got this, like, just giant expanse of brilliant white shirt front at the time of day where they're eating the biggest meal and drinking red wine and slurping their soup, and clearly they were going to have stains down the front of their shirts. And so the constant need for maintenance and stain removal clearly must have been just an absolute constant pressure, that you would not just need someone to be doing the labor, because probably it's not the president's, stain removing their own soup, but also that you would have to have enough, garments to constantly have one at the laundress.
Exactly. Right. I've got a couple dark suits, and I kind of rotate them a little bit. I don't really wear a suit that often anymore, but I used to combine it with a white shirt because that was just kind of the look. It seems like suits today keep winning. We have them still today, regardless of kind of other clothing options, regardless of casual Fridays, regardless of all of these other kind of elements in the world from a clothing standpoint. But suits keep winning, and I think that has to do somewhat with our institutions. And you talk a little bit about that, and I wonder if you'll talk for a second about why it is they keep winning. In particular, why are they surviving in this day and age? And maybe balance that a little bit with kind of some of sartorial choices that go on in certain industries like Silicon Valley, who is very casual and very non-traditional in terms of its wearing of a suit?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, is people saying, like, "Do we still care about suits?"
Yeah,
Isn't the suit dead? Or, like, neckties, or, "Is the necktie
yeah.
dead?" Um, and so partially, I have to think about this in terms of, like, justifying the fact that I just wrote a whole book about suits. But so I did ask myself this question all the time, like, "Is this still relevant? Is this just a history project, or does it have any kind of contemporary relevance?" Um, and I think that it does.
Mhm.
One of the things that I, um, kept thinking about was, you know, especially because of the relationship with the American Revolution, and one of the things that the American Revolution wanted to push back against was the idea of kings and monarchies, and this sort of centralization of power around a particular person. Um, and we don't have that centralization of power in the same way. But there is something interesting about the way that power has been decentralized. Um, and yet it is still associated with this garment. When we think about at least political power, when we look at lawyers or courts or um, presidential debates. And then if we get outside of our own country, if we look at, meetings of the United Nation or the G20 summit or things like that, everybody's wearing a suit with very few exceptions. Usually the women who are present are wearing some sort of suit or suit-like garment. It'll often include skirts and heels. Um, and yet there are a number of women, including, Angela Merkel, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, who are very well known for their pantsuits, based off of this, masculine garment. There's this pervasive idea that the suit is somehow related to the idea of democracy, and engaging in this sort of political discourse. And there are a few countries that don't participate in that. Saudi Arabia is really one of the few. Um, there have been recent rules passed around the world, where you're not allowed to wear traditional dress in parliament. You have to wear suits. So this idea of the suit being related to the project of democracy is not just American. It has really traveled around the world. So I just feel like when I hear stories like that, or even, a couple of years ago when Congress relaxed the rules on senators wearing suits on the floor of the House. I think that was really a moment where we were testing, is the suit dead? And there was such a backlash. And in response, there is now actually, in fact, a dress code where there has never been before in the history of Congress. And so those are the signs to me that the suit isn't dead. And maybe fewer people wear it. But there's still something, it still certainly has power, and that power is related to masculinity. And I think that correlation of power and identity is something that we should take a look at.
Just all great stuff. Of course, Smithsonian Associate author Chloe Chapin been our guest today. Written this wonderful book. Again, congratulations, Chloe, on Suitable, the Sartorial Revolution, and the Fashioning of Modern Men. We'll have links so that our audience can find out all about Chloe and all about her work. But again, Chloe, we'd love to have you back. Thank you so much for your generous time and answering all of my questions.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. It's been great chatting with you.
Love talking.
Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
The next time you see a black suit, look again. Look at the plainness, the restraint, the promise of seriousness, and then ask, who taught us to read those signals as competence, authority, and trust? Smithsonian Associate Chloe Chapin's Suitable shows us that clothing does more than cover the body. It carries politics, memory, gender, ambition, and power. The suit survived because institutions kept rewarding what it represented. Presidents wore it, executives wore it, judges, diplomats, and people asking to be believed wore it too. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of this conversation. what appears ordinary may be doing the most cultural work. My thanks to Smithsonian Associate Chloe Chapin for joining us today. Remember, you can find out more about Chloe Chapin and her work, her new book, Suitable. All of the background about her is in our notes today with all of the links, including links to Smithsonian Associates for more details on Chloe Chapin's upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. Thanks to Smithsonian Associates for helping us bring this remarkable story to you. Suitable, the Sartorial Revolution and the Fashioning of Modern Men is available now. I'm Paul Vogelsang. This is the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series. Thanks for listening. Be well. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. Stay curious, stay informed. Keep asking questions. We'll see you next time. Thank you.